In his book, To Change All Worlds, Dr. Carl Trueman writes, quote, "The very rhetoric and concepts of critical theory, the other, intersectionality, and their like, have become influential tools of wielding power rather than dismantling it. And so, as Frankfurt School members Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno themselves would no doubt point out, things have become their opposite. The liberator has become the tyrant. The tools of freedom have become the weapons of oppression." Close quote. Perhaps Goethe's Mephistopheles captured critical theory best when he uttered to Faust, "I am the spirit that negates." Dr. Carl Trueman on the philosophy and the danger of critical theory in his new book, To Change All Worlds, Critical Theory from Marx to Marcuse, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Born and raised in England, Carl Trueman is a graduate of the Universities of Cambridge with a master's in classics and Aberdeen with a PhD in church history, and is taught on the faculties of the Universities of Nottingham and Aberdeen before moving to the United States in 2001 to teach at Westminster Theological Seminary. In 2017-2018, he was the William E. Simon Visiting Fellow in Religion and Public Life in the James Madison program at Princeton University. Since 2018, he has served as professor at Grove City College in the Calderwood School of Arts and Humanities. Carl is widely published in both academic and popular circles, is a contributing editor at First Things and Touchstone Magazine, an opinion columnist at World Magazine, and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. His most recent books are The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Expressive Individualism, Cultural Amnesia, and the Road to Sexual Revolution, and Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. Also, the Oxford Handbook to Kelvin and Calvinism, and finally, To Change All Worlds, his newest book, Critical Theory from Marx to Marcuse, which is now available from Broadman and Holman. Carl's writing has appeared in Desiree Journal, Wall Street Journal, National Review Online, American Mind, Claremont Review of Books, and The Public Discourse. He and his wife, Catriona, have 2 adult sons and a granddaughter. Carl, welcome.
Great to be here, Todd. Thanks for having me on.
Segment 1, The Godfathers of Critical Theory. The poet Percy Bysshe Shelley observed that, quote, "Poets and philosophers are the unacknowledged legislators of the world," close quote. And Greek philosopher Plato noted that, quote, "Ideas are the source of all things." But it was the American scholar Richard Weaver who warned that, indeed, ideas have consequences. So, Carl, let's begin. First of all, this book is captivating, and I commend it to everybody who's listening to read To Change All Worlds, Critical Theory from Marx to Marcuse. Let's begin with the originators of ideas that led to the notion of critical theory. And we're going to get into what critical theory is. But in your book, you're unfolding the origins of this modern, what it seems like a modern iteration of this philosophical mindset of critical theory. Let's talk about the originators of these ideas that led to critical theory, starting with the 19th century German philosopher Hegel. And specifically, if you don't mind, what were some of Hegel's ideas that transformed the world and had an influence on another young German philosopher named Karl Marx?
Yeah, Hegel's a very interesting philosopher. Of course, quite an obscure philosopher as well. If you try to read Hegel, I think it's probably easier to read in German than he is in English translation. Hegel's great contribution, I think, to the origins of critical theory is he's a real historical thinker. He has a philosophy of history. And one of his great insights is that the way human beings think over time changes. To be a 4th century BC Athenian would be to have a different view of the world, to imagine the world in a different way than one would say if one was a late medieval peasant or a 17th century merchant or a 19th century Prussian. So one of the contributions of Hegel is this attention to changes in the way people think over time. But he does more than that, in that he sees that there is a logic involved in the way that people think over time. The language he uses to describe this is he sees history as a sort of the unfolding or the realization of what he calls spirit, which really, we might boil that down to say, the way that the idea of freedom is transformed and shaped and develops over time. And the influence he has on Karl Marx. Well, Marx, in his early days, is involved with a group that scholars call the young Hegelians. These are sort of we might say now, that the left-wing radicals who emerged from Hegel's shadow after Hegel's death, who use Hegel's philosophy of history really as a way of critiquing the status quo. If thinking is changing and thinking is moving towards this great realization of the spirit, then that gives you a place from which to, from their perspective, criticize the rather absolutist Prussian government of their day.
Right.
So in their hands, Hegel's thinking becomes the source of, we might say, revolutionary social criticism. The key thing for Marx is, and Marx himself uses this language I think it's at the afterword of the second edition of Das Kapital. Marx makes a comment to the effect that Hegel needs to be turned on his head, which Marx says is actually to put him the right way up. And what does Marx mean by that? He says, Hegel is mesmerized by ideas. Hegel thinks that ideas are the things that are driving history. Marx makes the observation, it's not ideas, it's material conditions. That the ideas represent, in a sort of mystical way, social relations that are really determined by economics. And so Marx's revolutionary thought relates to Hegel in both a positive and a negative way. Positively, he draws on Hegel for this social criticism and this historical process. Negatively, he says, Hegel puts his emphasis in the wrong place. We're not in the game of critiquing ideas so much as critiquing material conditions. And that's the sort of matrix out of which later critical theory will emerge in the early 20th century.
It was really amazing, and that's a wonderful, concise description of very complex philosophical thought. What I was very interested in, and having read a number of things about this, but it was new to me to understand through your book, was the notion of Marx. There was the young Marx who was more of a Hegelian thinker, and then there was an older Marx that kind of went into more of a economic, kind of just more hard-edged economics, if you will, at least if I understood it correctly. And I think you speak to this, to some of the rift within the Marxist movement at the Second International that happened, I think it was in 1919 or thereabouts, where there was sort of these Hegelian social criticizing, let's revolutionize the world more aggressively side of the Marxists. And there was the more passive, this is going to unfold on its own time. What are we doing? Going in there and mucking around, kind of a worldview. Am I characterizing that sort of distinction, or am I roughing up a little too much?
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something important, because there's a sense in which, on the one hand, Marx turns Hegel upside down and says it's material conditions that are important. On the other hand, there's also the question of consciousness. Yeah. How do you create this revolutionary consciousness? And certainly Marx in the 1840s is very interested, we might say, in consciousness at that point. And the most famous statement, of course, the one statement that a lot of people, if you ask them, give me a Marx quotation, they'll say, religion is the opium of the people. Yeah, yeah. And that comes from his notes, his introduction to Hegel's philosophy of right, or sometimes philosophy of law. And it's part of a much larger passage in which he's saying, the problem with religion is it's an idea that allows people to justify the status quo. It allows the poor to think that their conditions are acceptable because it's all going to be made right in eternity. And although Marx is a very materialist thinker, he makes this comment in that passage. He says, the criticism of religion has to be, right there at the start of the revolution. Because you have to tear down the illusion of the ideas used to buttress the status quo before people will realize how terrible their conditions are. And, in some ways you see I think one might even say it's a problem in Marxism, if you like. That on the one hand, yeah, it's material conditions, but on the other hand, ideas are important.
Yes.
How do we relate to these ideas? And what you get with the critical theorists of the 20th century is a reaction against that hard economic Marxism that you described, where capitalism is just going to collapse at some point, and then we'll have the workers' utopia. There are those who say, no, capitalism seems remarkably resilient. We have to create a revolutionary consciousness. And what they do is they really start drawing on the ideas that Marx was laying out in the 1840s, relatively early in his career, where he is interested in what he would have called the critique of ideology, the critique of the ideas that prevent people from seeing their suffering, their economic suffering, as it really is, and therefore being motivated to do something about it.
This is so fascinating to me because when one studies this stuff from afar, it seems like this is rarefied air. I mean, how does this ever come down to earth? And then you realize how it ultimately, and we're going to talk about this again and again with your book, the notion that philosophy should not be only descriptive, it should change things. It should be actionable. And that's, I know we'll get into this because it's something that recurs as a theme again and again. I want to ask you, so not to return to Hegel for one more minute, this is my grappling with it. So tell me if I'm correct in saying this. There's an element of determinism in Hegel's thinking where what ought to unfold, whether it's painful or good, will unfold, and that human beings are kind of more bit players in the grand drama of this kind of spirit of history, if you will. And that second, that society and its members are shaped by and contingent to historical and cultural forces of their own time more than they are shaped by or formed by entrenched aspects of human nature that transcend time, place, and circumstance. Not to keep kind of banging up against Hegel, but is that a fair assessment of a Hegelian mindset?
I think so. I mean, Hegel has this term we translate in English as the cunning of reason. And what he means there is that history will effectively do what history does and come right in the end, regardless of the individual motivations of the various actors on the historical stage. So if you like, that the historical process heads in a direction which it will go in, and it will use our individual motives and in ways that we don't expect and don't anticipate, and maybe counter to the way we think. But this cunning of reason is this, I think it would be something of a mischaracterization, but it captures something of it. It's almost like this impersonal force that's drawing everything forward to the end of history. So that's certainly a part of it. And I can't remember the second part of your question.
It was the notion that society and its members are shaped by and contingent to historical and cultural forces of their time, more than the transcendent human nature that's sort of refractory to molding over generations.
Yeah, and I think when you have Hegel, and particularly in Marx, I think this is the case, that the question of what is human nature becomes something that certainly in Marx, that there's a big debate among Marxists as to whether Marx had a concept of human nature. And I think I think that he did, and I think it was, human beings are those who intentionally make things. Birds build nests, beavers may build dams, but they don't do it intentionally. They do it instinctively. Human beings, we design houses. All houses can be different. We have an artistic impulse in the way we make things. And I think that would be what Marx would see as distinguishing us from one of the creatures. But that's a pretty thin notion of human nature. Yeah. Because as we know, the way we make things changes over time. And this is one of Marx's point, that the medieval blacksmith makes a horseshoe in a very, very different way, and in terms of a very different set of relations to technology, materials, and to his social context than the factory worker who just presses a button and a hammer comes down and stamps out a horseshoe. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. Human nature is, from a Christian perspective, one would have to say, very, very thin. Having said that, one would want to acknowledge that there's some truth in the Hegel position, even the Marx position, that, the way we make things, for example, does affect how we relate to each other, how we think about the world. One might say that today we live in a society where precisely because of the impersonal nature of industrial labor, we don't give ourselves value by what we make. We give ourselves value by what we consume.
Mm-hmm.
So one would want to acknowledge that, I would say as a Christian, there is a transcendent human nature, but it may not always look like, normative 1950s
Right.
American maleness, for example.
Right.
It perhaps has more social construction than many Christians would intuitively acknowledge.
And on that note, it seems that to become too fundamental on the notion that and we do believe the notion that there is a strain in our human nature, a very strong strain that is transcendent across time and space, and so much of that is dignified, fallible, redeemable, and so on. But we also can say that there is a degree of malleability by the forces around us. I mean, so to my way of thinking, or let me ask you this: do Marx, do Lukács, do Korsch, and some of these other thinkers, do they lean too heavily on the notion that in this generation, at this time, with these historical forces, with these cultural influences, these people are so impacted by, they're so malleable by those things, and so little affected by some strain of human nature that travels through? Do they get it wrong by just tipping way too far on the malleability of the existing kind of milieu of the day, as opposed to, say, the Christian who says, well, there's part of that's true, but there's also this transcendent aspect of what it means to be human across time?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I would say that they raise a lot of very interesting questions, and we will get to this in a later section. When we think more detail about how Christians should respond to critical theory. But I think one place where I would give critical theorists typically, high marks is they raise some difficult and awkward questions that Christians have to wrestle with. Where I would score them low is, I do think they tend to historicize human nature to the point where a Christian has got to say, no, actually, there is more to being human than merely the network of immediate, historically determined social relations in which we exist at this point in time. And I think that's critical to do because it allows us then to get beyond the kind of fragmentary identity politics that feeds off this. Carl and Todd, what we share, human nature, is far less important than what distinguishes us. Listeners can't see this, of course, but we do actually also share exactly the same haircuts.
Wonderful hair.
Or lack of haircuts, one might say.
You have a beautiful head, Carl.
But I think, that the point there is, one of the weaknesses we have in politics at the moment is that the Marxist critical theory strain has kind of won because it's got rid of that which binds us together in comparison to the sort of stuff that now divides us.
I want to make a note of this too. This is an eminently fair book. There's so many books out there that come out that are just seething. It's just bile about critical theory, and there's a lot of problems with critical theory. So this is this work that you're offering is truly an honest exploration of the history of ideas. And like I think in a way that so many books do not do it, that what you say is where are the defects that rise in some of our modern thinking, capitalism, and so on and so forth, that maybe a question out of the critical theory, out of the Marxist book raises, and we say, well, there's a point to this, but it only up to a point, and they go way too far. I think one reads this and says, this author, Carl Trueman, is profoundly fair and objective in his intellectual incisiveness surrounding this topic, and for that reason, it stands alone as a pillar of commentary on critical theory. So that's a little side note, editorial comment, and endorsement of people reading this book.
Well, thanks very much. And a couple of things there. First of all, as a Christian, I think the commandment not to bear false witness is an important one in all areas of our life. Secondly, I think a lot of people, good people, are just genuinely confused by critical theory. And I think that the heat and the hoo-ha that surrounds it forces people to take sides before they've really thought through the issues. And what I wanted to do in the book was give people the tools to think through the issues. And then thirdly, and again, maybe we'll return to this a little bit later, but I'm, Hey, I'm a Protestant. This is a Catholic podcast, I know, but I'm a big fan of Cardinal Newman. And I love that statement in Newman. I think it's in his sermon on the development of doctrine, which is his sort of prelim to his great work on the development of doctrine, where he makes a comment to the effect that all heresies are an aspect of the truth pressed to the expense of all other aspects of the truth. And when I teach critical theorists in class, when I teach Marx, Nietzsche, when I teach ancient church and I teach the heresies, I always ask the students, what's the legitimate question that's being asked here? We don't have to agree with Arius on the relationship between Father and the Son, but he's asking the question, how do Father and Son relate? And all Christians have to wrestle with that. And I think that applies to critical theorists as well. How does the way we make things shape how we think about ourselves, for example?
Yeah, so good. Such a great question to be asking. I love what's the legitimate question here. So Carl, in reading the philosophy of Ludwig Feuerbach, who was a disciple of Hegel, Marx made a striking note that fundamentally altered the direction, not only of philosophy, but of the history of the 20th century. And what Marx noted was this. He said, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Close quote. So again, Carl, I mentioned this earlier. This is a theme I came across in To Change All Worlds. And by the way, just consider the title, To Change All Worlds, which was obviously not by accident. I came across this theme again and again in your book. Why does the actionability of philosophy compared to the descriptive function of philosophy matter so much in the history of ideas?
Yeah, well, this is, there are a number of observations one could make on that. First of all, philosophy that is just descriptive in Marx's terms is what he would call, ideology. It becomes a way of naturalizing the status quo, of saying that this is the way things have to be. I mean, he's very appreciative of Feuerbach because he thinks Feuerbach gives a much more thorough materialist grounding to the understanding of reality than Hegel did. So religion, for example, becomes the projection of material conditions onto God. And we might say theological statements really are mystical statements about social relations here and now. So he gets a lot from Feuerbach. But the problem he has with Feuerbach is that's where Feuerbach stops. It's a kind of, so what are you going to do with this, Ludwig? You're making this point. Where do we go? And when you think of that statement, it's the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The purpose is to change it. That's philosophically explosive. And one of the most obvious ways we see that playing out in critical theory is in the notion of truth. Most of us have an intuitive understanding of truth where if the statement, the cat is on the mat, is true if the cat is actually on the mat. That's how we sort of somewhat naively, one might say, think of truth. Marx would say, that statement's true if it gets the homeowner to leave the house to check the mat and allows the revolutionaries to seize his home, for example. Or, George Lukács makes the comment, he's talking about truth. He said, truth isn't correspondence between words and reality. Truth is that which moves the revolution forward. And we've seen a little glimpse of this, interesting enough, on the right in the recent election, when there was the hoo-ha about, are Haitians in Ohio, I think it was, eating pet cats. Yeah. And one leading Republican politician put out a tweet at some point saying, okay, it's not true, but it got the issue being discussed. And I remember reading that and thinking, I'm generally a conservative guy. It's not that I'm unsympathetic to the Republicans, but I'm thinking, Lukács would be proud. That's a George Lukács kind of statement. Man. It doesn't matter whether the Haitian ate the cat.
Exactly.
The question is, does it move the consciousness in a way that will oppose immigration? So that's a very revolutionary statement by Marx, and to me, it's quite interesting to see that principle not only in critical theory, but in the way critical theory ideas are migrating to the right, one might say, in some contexts.
Segment 2, the vocabulary of true and false consciousness. In the early 20th century, Karl Korsch, a German Marxist theoretician, and George Lukács, a Hungarian Marxist philosopher, suggested that people are hoodwinked by what they perceive about their society. They're subject to a naive realism and develop a false consciousness that can only be dispelled by an unsparing Marxist critique of society. As you just mentioned, Karl, in To Change All Worlds, you wrote, quote, "For Karl Korsch, what makes a philosophy, idea, or theory true is not its simple correspondence to reality. Reality, after all, cannot be accessed in a straightforward, non-ideological manner. Rather, truth values are determined by whether a particular idea or claim furthers the revolutionary cause," close quote. And Karl, you go on, quote, "What Karl Marx means in some of his writings is that truth needs to be reconceptualized, not as an idea, but as a practice. Do ideas work to achieve the revolutionary change in society for which Marxism aims? If yes, they are true. If no, they are false. This is the notion of truth under which Karl Korsch is operating," close quote. So, Karl, I'm reading this, and I've seen this before in the many works. You see Whittaker Chambers, you see the works of Lenin, you see just all these descriptions of these mental acrobatics that Marxist theory goes to say what you're seeing isn't really what you're seeing. Let me tell you what you're seeing. These ideas have a chilling subjectivity, a menacing relativism that almost seems to threaten to devolve to arbitrary power. What becomes of objectivity as we traditionally know it in the eyes of these Marxist thinkers?
Well, really, one could answer that in two ways. In one sense, there is no true objectivity. There is no common ground, really, on which one can debate these things. And we've seen that in more recent iterations of critical theory where, the idea of, they call standpoint epistemology kicks in, that certain people can't contribute to a debate because they're white, for example. And that immediately disqualifies anything they might say because it's not the content of what they say that's important. It's deemed a power bid. It's a manipulative power bid. So on one level, it utterly destroys any possibility of discussion. Closely connected to that, of course, it creates a new knowledge elite in that what you have in critical theorists really are those who have the magic spectacles that allow them to see everything as it really is or as it really should be, and everybody else is benighted and laboring under the cloud of ideology. So there's those two aspects to it, I think. And again, one of the big questions for critical theorists in the early 20th century is really, particularly pointed for somebody like Karl Korsch or George Lukács or Adorno and Horkheimer is, why do poor people vote against their best interests? They should be voting for the communists, but they're voting for Mussolini, or they're voting for Hitler, or they're voting for the nationalists. And we see that again, today. Why is it that the white working class are so stupid? They vote for Donald Trump. You get that from the sort of the progressive elites today. And that's the question of false consciousness. But of course, to critique false consciousness, you have to assume that you yourself have something approximating true consciousness. And that's where the sort of intellectual Gnosticism and elitism kicks in.
This is the thing that always gets me. There are so many contradictions. So, for instance, the proletariat revolution is inevitable. It's coming. It's determined. And yet we need to help it along. It's sort of like, Lenin, the vanguard of the revolution. So this thing is supposed to happen, and maybe it's just that it's going to happen, but it's not happening fast enough, and we want to motivate this process. Or simultaneously, there is no truth, but we are actually going to propose something that's absolutist, that in effect is declaring a truth. You're a victim of false consciousness, but I'm going to be the proponent of a true consciousness. We don't believe in power hierarchies and power structures, and yet in the end, we are going to establish one. It just always strikes me that there's a criticism that you say, there's a point to that criticism. There's a legitimacy to this critique or that aspect of people are getting hoodwinked by something. There are powerful people manipulating other people, etc. But the notion that these people who are the critics are not going to go and are already going and creating the very same structure only with their people in place and not the other people in place, it seems hypocritical and somewhat ironic. Is that a fair criticism?
Yes, and I think this is one of the ways that sort of certain later iterations of critical theory sort of attempt to address that. There is really from the 1960s onwards, there's a new strand of critical theory that emerges that is perhaps most closely associated with the figure of somebody like Michel Foucault in France. And when Foucault gives his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France in 1970, he identifies Hegel as the enemy. And by implication, Marxism as well. And the problem he sees with Hegel and Marx is that they're systematizers, that they too produce these systems that oppress. And what you get in the kind of critical theory that emerges from this, I would say, sort of anti-Hegelian strand is it's a more Nietzschean kind of endless critique of power. One of the obvious problems, I think, and I think Nietzsche sees this in the 19th century, but it's become very explicit in more recent years, is that as soon as you establish any category as stable, it can become a tool for the manipulation and the marginalization of others.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, if critical theory ever triumphs, it will triumph in the form of queer theory, because queer theory is the war against all categories on that level. And we see examples of this. It helps us understand some of the things that are going on the left of politics today. For example, Andrew Sullivan, the gay Anglo-American journalist, who I think was, I don't agree with him, but I would say he was certainly one of the most thoughtful and articulate advocates for gay marriage in the run-up to the Supreme Court judgment of 2015. He's certainly not somebody who shares much in common with myself on those kind of issues. But it's very interesting that he's now decried as a transphobe. So, 20 years ago, he was the radical edge of the sexual revolution. Now he's only slightly less reactionary than you and you and me, Todd. When he interviewed me, I can't remember if I said it on the podcast or behind the scenes. I remember commenting to him and saying, you're a gay white guy, which gives you one more point on the hierarchy than me. I'm a straight white guy, But when people get confused about the constant flux of progressive politics, I think it points to the flaw in the original critical theory that you're pointing to, that there is this kind of elitist assumption that whatever they say about truth, they actually have it.
Exactly.
Others don't.
Yep.
And somebody like Foucault comes along and says, hang on a minute, that's a truth claim too. And you too need to be debunked. And what you really end up with is this, I would say, constant revolution. It's not that we're moving towards the workers' paradise. We're heading to a place of constant revolution of language, the constant revolution of the way we think about ourselves in relation to those around us.
It's fascinating. So, Carl, your books serve up a vocabulary lesson in Marxism for the untutored reader. So, a few words speak acutely to truth and the illusion of truth. So, I want to explore a few words that you kind of do a great job of defining, starting with the word reification. Could you say what is reification?
Yeah, reification is this. It's a term that George Lukács uses. Lukács he's a Hungarian literary critic who in 1923 writes this very influential, or publishes a collection of essays, History and Class Consciousness. He will later go on, incidentally, to have a very despicable role in 1950s post-Stalin takeover of Hungary. Lukács was he was a brilliant man, but he was ultimately a wicked man as well. But he has this term reification, and he uses it in a way that I think is fascinating and to some extent helpful. He says that reification is the granting of of sort of objective, solid reality to something that doesn't really exist, that then allows us to treat human beings as things. Now, you might say, that sounds really confusing. Well, I'll give you a sort of a straightforward example that I think would help listeners grasp what Lukács is getting at. Think of the term the economy. We talk about the economy all the time, but I would say, what is the economy? I can't walk down the street and point to something and say, oh, look, it's the economy. I can't put it in a test tube and break it down into chemical compounds. I can't chop it up and look at it under a microscope. The economy is actually a broad term we use for covering a vast and incredibly complicated set of social and economic relationships. But now think about how we use the term economy. I'm the CEO of a company, and I say, okay, we got to lay off 20 of our people. And you might say, well, why have we got to do that? And say, the economy demands it. The state of the economy demands it. And Lukács would say, look what you're doing there. You're using a term for something that's really a description of an incredibly complicated thing. Yeah. You're turning it into a noun. You're granting it a kind of independent existence, and you're setting it up above actual real human relations and real human people, such that, okay, Mr. Smith is going to lose his job and he's going to be on the streets in 6 weeks' time, but that's unfortunate because the economy demands it. Yeah. So reification is this way of granting reality to something that doesn't really have reality, and then using that to turn people, subjects into objects, people into things.
And this is a tool. And the point ultimately that in this definition is that this is a tool being used by the powers that be, and Marx and Lukács is basically saying we are victims of this, and the powers that be are using this consistently. How about the word alienation?
Alienation is, Marx uses the term alienation in the 1840s. He sort of drops it the late 1840s and doesn't revisit again. But alienation is a term he draws from Hegel. Again, to think about what does Marx mean by alienation? Well, primarily it's what industrial labor does to human beings. Its manifestation is that we just don't feel good. We don't feel the world is right. We're not relating to each other in the right way. And you would say, industrial capitalism alienates people in a number of ways. It alienates them from the things they make. So, for example, the medieval artisan who weaves a basket, he may go and collect the straw for weaving the basket. He weaves it in a certain style. He puts love and care into it. And then he exchanges it in the marketplace for, say, a piece of meat or something. But when he sees somebody walking past with a basket that he's made, he's able to point at that and say, I made that. I take some pride in that. Put that man in a factory. He has the only relationship he has to the production of the basket is he presses a button. Now, when I was a student, I worked one summer in a factory, and what we did was we made the metal parts that go in the middle of ring binders. I can honestly say, Todd, I've never opened a ring binder, looked at the metal part and thought,
I made that.
I made that. That's what makes me feel good about myself. No. Marx would say that in industrial capitalism prevents us from, if you like, finding ourselves and our value in the things we make. Secondly, another form of alienation might be, where do I find my value in my work? It's in the money I earn. And that turns me, in my boss's mind, it turns me into just a line item on the budget. My sense of self-worth comes from the money I earn, not from the things I make. People start to treat each other then as objects. I always think, the example I use for students in class is, we're recording this in Advent, just before Christmas. Think of Christmas Carol. One of the lovely scenes in Christmas Carol is Mr. Fezziwig's ball. And, Fezziwig, he treats his employees once a year to a Christmas party. To Fezziwig, these are people. Scrooge, when Scrooge sees that, Scrooge begins to realize that he's not Fezziwig.
Yeah.
For him, when Bob Cratchit asks for that day off and Scrooge says, Christmas Day, a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. For Scrooge, Cratchit is nothing but a line item in the budget. And Marx would say that puts Cratchit in a position of alienation. He's being treated like a thing at this point. So alienation is it's a somewhat foggy term to define with real precision, but it essentially means human beings being out of joint with existence and out of joint with each other. And for Marx, the primary reason for that is the way we make things, the way we relate, he would say, to the means of production alienates us from ourselves and from the things we make.
By the way, Carl, forevermore, when I see a ring binder, I'm going to look at that and say, Carl Trueman made that. So just so you know, I'm taking you away from alienation and letting you know. I know. So let's do one more term, and that's false consciousness. It figures so centrally to all this. What is false consciousness? False
consciousness, again, it goes back to that when I say, why do the working classes vote against their best interests when they vote sincerely? The person who votes, the Frankfurt School would say the guy who votes for the Nazi Party in 1933, the working class man who does that, he's not forced to do that. He does that because he's convinced that's the right thing to do, and that will be the thing that makes his life better. Yeah. And that's the impact of the grip of ideology. Ideology shapes our view of the world in ways that don't actually track with the way the world really is. So another example might be, let's go back to Bob Cratchit when Mrs. Cratchit is trashing Scrooge over dinner, and Cratchit comes to his defense.
Yeah,
he's not that bad.
False consciousness.
Let's have a toast to Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. I think we'd all say, Cratchit's not being disingenuous there. Yeah. He's just not getting it.
Yeah.
And false consciousness is that which is cultivated by all of culture, shapes the way we think about the world. And this is where the critical theorists get really interesting, because they're interested in how false consciousness gets formed. And it doesn't just get formed by the work you do in the factory. It gets formed by what you do with your spare time, the movies you watch, the books you read, that kind of thing. And that shapes how you think about the world. And a bit like religion for Marx, religion is false consciousness. It's the opium of the people. It makes you think that it's okay to suffer here and now because God's going to reward me in heaven. Well, that's a religious form of false consciousness. The idea that Hitler is the Messiah who's going to save the working classes, that's another form of false consciousness.
These definitions you do just here summarizing them are so helpful, and also in the book, just the way you unfold them in the midst of the philosophical story of critical theory. It's fascinating. So let's talk about is there some truth to the shortcomings of capitalism that Marxist and critical theory philosophers point out? I mean, we do know there are people that in historically, even today, are Scrooges. There are powers that be that are they are using words like the economy or these vast impersonal excuses for hard truths of what they're doing. So the one says, well, we just take all the critical theorists and the Marxists saying and just throw it out because it's all evil and it's all there is to it. But the other alternative is to say, is that, like you said, I think what you said, what's the legitimate claim here?
Yeah.
Is there a legitimate truth here? And again, capitalism does often commodify and devalue individuals. We know that. Is there room? So if there are some fair critiques, but they go way too far, is there room for a kind of a modus vivendi between the system of capitalism and the Marxist detractors? Or is it like, no, because the Marxist detractors basically want root and branch elimination of the system, destabilization. They will not allow for it. It's either one or the other. What's your sense about that?
Yeah, I think you're making a good point at the end there, Todd. I think what Marx would say, and we saw this with the critical race theory debates in sort of 2020. The idea is the Marxist approach. It's not that capitalism is it's not that the injustices are a bug in the system.
Mm-hmm.
They're part of the design. Part of the purpose of capitalism is to exploit the working classes. So that's not a bug. And this means that Marxism, true Marxism is not what they would say reformist. It's not a question of, okay, we have a system here, but hey, we could pass antitrust legislation, or we could develop a welfare state, or we could do these other things that essentially deal with the problems, the bugs in the system. To a Marxist, that would be, no, that's papering over the cracks.
Yeah.
You're conning people into thinking the system can be reformed at that point. So Marxism, the various branches of Marxism as political philosophies, I think, really call for root and branch overthrow of the system. And we saw this, as I said, with critical race theory and that idea of systemic racism. It's not that, okay, I would look at the American Constitution and say, it's basically a good document. It's not being consistently applied. It was applied by broken, sinful human beings. There are flaws there which we can iron out. No, the answer would be the American Constitution is a con trick. It's a mask for white supremacy and for keeping white people in pole position. So I think on that level, one would have to say, no, you can't buy into Marxism. Returning to what I said earlier about raising interesting questions, though, I mean, I would have to say there is a reason why certain Marxist strands of critical theory have become popular, particularly among younger people over the last 10 or 15 years, and that is, capitalism doesn't seem to be offering quite the opportunities to the rising generation that it did to my generation. I grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in the Thatcher-Reagan, post-Thatcher-Reagan era, fall of the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. It was relatively easy for me, for example, to get onto the housing ladder, et cetera, et cetera. I think when you have a situation where goals that I was able to achieve in my late 20s seem to be something that kids can only dream of maybe in their mid-40s now. The problems with capitalism seem to loom rather large, and that makes younger people vulnerable, understandably vulnerable to patterns of critique of capitalism, democracy, et cetera, that I would regard as having been discredited. But I can see that those who did not live through the discrediting of those ideas might be attracted by the sort of the romanticism that they present. So I would say, capitalism is certainly a flawed system. The difference between myself and a Marxist would be, I would say, these are bugs that we can try to, I don't think we can ever get rid of them entirely, but we can try to mitigate them. We don't need to tear the whole system down and rebuild something from the ground up, because that always ends in catastrophic bloodshed. History clearly teaches that.
And on that note, like you just said, this is the French Revolution. This is the Bolshevik Revolution. This is the National Socialist Revolution. That the notion that we understand, it's not just. You don't want to just say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but with the realization, this is a very Christian perspective as well, is that there is no, as Vogelin would say, immanentizing the eschaton. There is no bringing perfection to this side of the grave. There's a kind of an Edmund Burkean notion or a Hippocratic notion of, let's do the best we can. Let's recognize the flaws that we bring to the system, because we are the system and we're fallible, flawed human beings. So it doesn't mean don't strive for the better, but to just say, well, we're going to achieve perfection, but we need to scorch this place and then start anew, and we're going to rebuild it. It's like, well, and then the heads are going to roll, just like in all these other circumstances. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think so. And I think from a Christian perspective, earthly utopias are really, any Christian who argues for a sort of political earthly utopia, right or left, I don't think they're reading the same Bible that I'm reading. I don't see that there. I'm very much influenced by Augustine, really. I think Augustine's City of God is it's not an easy book, but any listeners who are interested in reading it, there's a wonderful abbreviated version. I think Hans Urs von Balthasar did an excellent abbreviated version that Ignatius Press published. That's a great way of getting the kernel of the argument. But Augustine has, in some ways, Augustine, to me, he's the great Christian critical theorist. He offers a critique of society but he avoids the perils of utopian ambition and avoids the perils of total earthly revolution as well. Book 19, for example, is a wonderful reflection upon how the Christian can seek the good of the earthly city in which he or she is an exile in a way that doesn't compromise their faith, but doesn't lead to the catastrophic results that one will later find in more utopian revolutionary thinking.
Well, we need these revolutionaries to be reading Augustine. It only preceded them by like 1,800 years or however many years. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Critical Theory and the Frankfurt School. In To Change All Worlds, Carl Trueman describes the concerns of critical theory as the following, quote, the socially constructed nature of reality, the manipulative nature of truth claims, the manner in which consciousness or discourses of power are formed, maintained, and operated. The purpose of theory is not so much to describe the status quo as to destabilize it, and the connection of intellectual work to political activism. Close quote. So, Carl, now we're getting into the kind of the centrality of this book. When one hears the words critical theory, it conjures up the images of its popularizers, if you will, specifically the Frankfurt School. So, who exactly was the Frankfurt School? How did their work begin? And how did National Socialism figure into the genesis of the Frankfurt School and critical theory?
Well, the Frankfurt School was founded in 1923. It's a sort of intellectual think tank attached to a university in Frankfurt, and it becomes the center of a new kind of Marxist thought. It starts the Institute for Social Research, and what the Frankfurt School sought to do was develop a form of revolutionary social criticism that addressed this problem. We talked in the last segment about false consciousness, that was really addressing how is it that false consciousness is formed, and the Frankfurt School is it draws heavily on the earlier Karl Marx. Marx's works actually start to get published in the it's odd in that the Marx of the 1840s is not really well known. His stuff only starts to emerge in the kind of 1930s as it happens. But a lot of the work of the early Frankfurt School and of an associated thinker like George Lukács, because it reads Hegel so carefully and sort of rediscovers Marx even without having direct access to Marx's texts. So Marx is a key influence. But there are two other important influences, I think, that flow into the early Frankfurt School. One of them is Friedrich Nietzsche. We tend to think of Nietzsche often as a thinker of the right. Actually, Nietzsche's a kind of fairly apolitical thinker in some ways. He's a philosopher of power. And Nietzsche's social criticism is of great interest to the Frankfurt School. And the other thinker is Sigmund Freud. Okay. Now, again, Freud is not a particularly political thinker, and in some ways he's quite conservative in some of his social ideas. But what Freud does is, if you're exploring this issue of false consciousness, you've got to explore the inner space. You've got to get to grips with psychological categories. And what Freud does for the early Frankfurt School is offer them a way of exploring what's going on. And, take, for example, Hitler. Why do working class men work for Hitler? Well, this is to make it very simplistic boiling down of Frankfurt School arguments. But, Hitler is a strong father figure. Freud argues that, people are, that the Oedipus complex is critical to the formation of what he calls the superego. The role of the father is critical. And, working class men grow up generally in pretty socially conservative homes relative to family hierarchies. And when they leave home and get work, they're looking for dad. They're looking for a father figure to follow. So the strong man who will bear all the responsibility and the burdens for them is very, very attractive. So Freud is a third figure. He's not part of the Frankfurt School, but you have this brilliant group of thinkers. Most significantly, I think, Theodor, Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, who see potential, not only in Hegel and Marx, but also in Nietzsche and Freud, for developing a new kind of Marxist thinking that will hopefully foster a proper revolutionary consciousness in the working class.
So Carl, critical theory, as these individuals you've mentioned are unfolding this, influenced, as you said, by Nietzsche, by Freud, by Marx, it attacks traditional theory as a tool of the capitalist powers that be. And as you write in To Change All Worlds, quote, "This is the central point of critical theory. Approaches that seem to be objective, commonsensical, or simply stating the obvious are in fact means by which the latent interests of the dominant group within society are asserted and protected. The systems of belief that support them have the appearance of unassailable and disinterested truths, but are in fact highly manipulative," close quote. So Carl, notwithstanding some of the warts of the capitalist system, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but I want to kind of just put a fine point on it. Notwithstanding some of the warts of the capitalist system, why are the adherents to critical theory so certain that they have cornered their market on truth, or that? And I know you said, well, it's really kind of destabilizing existing truth senses, and maybe there isn't an objectivity, but it seems that they can't get away from saying we have the true consciousness.
Yeah,
and we can't take you out of your benighted false consciousness. What is it? Just the arrogance of what it means to be human? How do they find that they have the true consciousness and everybody else is wrong?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And as you alluded to earlier on, I think Foucault sort of puts his finger on that to some extent. I think essentially they themselves buy into a certain ideology. They buy in broad terms the Marxist eschatology of the ultimate triumph of the working class, that the working class is the meaning of history. And that's the basic truth they assume. They don't put a lot of flesh on that in grounds of, they're kind of coy about describing what the utopia will look like. I think they understand that from the standpoint of a dystopian perspective, it's hard to anticipate what the utopia will look like, but they just assume that if you can tear down the dystopia, the utopia will emerge in its place. And that's, from a Christian perspective, we say, well, those are faith commitments. Yeah. If not blind faith commitments at points. You're buying into something that really is, somewhat intellectually disreputable from a lot of perspectives there. So I think you're putting your finger on something. And it's also interesting, the Frankfurt School themselves, Marxism is as fractious and vociferous as Christianity. You have as many Marxist sects as you have Marxists almost. And the Frankfurt School were often themselves being criticized by more mainline Marxists for their so-called idealism. That they placed too much emphasis on ideas, and that they were always in danger of, in some ways, tilting towards being descriptive rather than revolutionary. Even George Lukács, doesn't have a lot of time for the Frankfurt School. I think he refers to them as living in the Grand Hotel Abyss. They can tell you everything that's going wrong, but they don't actually do anything to move things forward in any way. So, you're making a very, very good point, and it's. And we see it in certain modern iterations of critical theory. I don't know if it's still the case, but certainly the last time I checked the Black Lives Matter website, when you look at their sort of manifesto proposals, they're very clear on what they want to tear down. Defund the police, abolish this, very clear proposals. Then you come to what do they want to replace these things with? And I say to students, you then move into the realm of kind of romantic poetry.
Yeah.
It's sort of, well, we'll have a village, and well, okay, but what does it look like?
Yes.
Will the village need a police force,
Yes.
or a police force called something else, but still functionally a police force? So, when you get down to, critical theory sort of wants to have its cake and eat it.
Yes.
Certainly in the Frankfurt School, they want to have their utopian vision, but they don't want to actually articulate their utopian vision.
Yeah, well said. There's a lot of works that have or ideas that have spun out of obviously the Frankfurt School's work, and so one in particular that you address in the book is Herbert Marcuse's work, Repressive Tolerance. And I want to see if I understand this correctly. So Marcuse, as I see it, opposes free speech in the way the existing capitalist system defines and allows it, because Marcuse seems to claim such freedom is a tool of the system that diffuses revolutionary energies, so that any systemic freedoms that fail to destabilize, revolutionize, and overturn the existing system should be restricted. So, First of all, am I getting that right? And then second of all, if I am, is this not a case where to fight totalitarianism, it seems that they're creating a totalitarianism?
Oh, yeah. I think on your second point, yes, inevitably it's going to go to a kind of totalitarian position. And we see this again emerging in contemporary American culture with the increasing dislike of notions of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, particularly on campuses and among young people, where the right to free speech is regarded as a right to violence in some places. I mean, there's a whole host of stuff that lies behind that claim. But what Marcuse is essentially saying, freedom of speech is a false freedom. It allows you to think you can change the system simply because you can publish a book like Herbert Marcuse does. And the system can then point and say, hey, look, you're free and we're fair because you're allowed to write your essay on repressive tolerance. You can give that lecture and nobody will stop you. And Marcuse's point there is that, but that's effectively allowing the system to remain in place. You're just accommodating it. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir makes a similar comment relative to women. She says, you can allow a woman to be Secretary General of a Soviet Communist Party, but that doesn't liberate women. It's a sop thrown to make people think that the system is liberating women. So Marcuse has this, again, it's very parasitic because he's utterly dependent upon freedom of speech. He's utterly dependent on the freedoms that capitalism gives. He's not giving these lectures in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s. But on the other hand, he's hitting against us and saying, it's pretend. It's pretend freedom.
Yeah, that's well said. Well said, Carl. Because I love asking smart individuals like you who write great books, to demystify something that has mystified me for a long time. And one of those things is the word dialectic. And so I remember way back when I was in middle school, reading dialectical materialism was what was kind of bandied about when it came to Karl Marx. So this is a word that appears numerous times in your book, To Change All Worlds. And as I understand it, and I think you've helped me to understand it, and maybe you can disabuse me of the fact, maybe I didn't understand it. So tell me. So as I understand it, a dialectic is a paradox. It's kind of a tension between opposites with the irony that one thing gives way to its opposite. So for example, the Enlightenment, quote, liberated man from the enslavement to God and the strictures of morality and opened him to a science-oriented, materialistic, independent existence. The irony, however, is that devoid of God and the strictures of morality, the, quote, liberating Enlightenment ultimately enslaved man as a thing, an object, as a commodity. Am I understanding that as a potential example of dialectic, or am I far off field?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, its most basic level, dialectic simply pointing to the fact that, truth has to be understood relationally. I mean, you could use the example of a marriage. I use this example in class. Define marriage for me. And I say, the way you define marriage on day one of your marriage is not the way you define it after 25 years of marriage or 50 years of marriage. The definition of marriage changes over time as these two very different people interact with each other. And we would say edges get knocked off, bits get smoothed out, et cetera, et cetera. So on one level, it's pointing to we might say, the process nature of how we think about truth. When we're looking at the Frankfurt School, the great Bible of the Frankfurt School is Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor, Adorno, and Max Horkheimer. And at the center of that book, they're discussing the relationship between human beings and nature. What's interesting is they never define nature. Because they can't define nature, because the point they're trying to make is that the concept of nature changes over time. The way we think about what nature is changes in the historical process. And at the heart of that book, there is this, I think, fantastic and Well, let me qualify it first of all saying I think their view of enlightenment is somewhat simplistic. The enlightenment we know is a much more diverse phenomenon than they make it. But the point they make really about kind of science, if you like, is this, that science shatters God. Science liberates us from God, but then becomes a new God.
Yeah.
It doesn't actually make us free. And when you think about that, again, I know that almost certainly be a variety of opinion on COVID in the audience. I don't want to offend anybody by saying this, but saying, think about how science was used in COVID. It was used as an unanswerable authority within which human freedom had to be accommodated. Now, that may have been a good thing or it may have been a bad thing, but it was certainly a thing. And I think the Frankfurt School would say, isn't it interesting that, if you like, we could put it in other terms, and we could say the Enlightenment smashed the power of the priesthood, only to put a new priesthood in place. The old priest is replaced by the new physician or the new epidemiologist or something. So, Todd, your summary, I think, captured it quite beautifully.
There's so many paradoxes and so many ironies in this, and it's striking. Like you said, as soon as you say we're going to make things new, it's replaced with a different iteration of the old, just different players in place, and so it's fascinating. So I'm going to return to something we talked about earlier, Carl. Critical theory seems to be as I've read this book, which is a wonderful book, again, To Change All Worlds. Critical theory seems to be a scorched earth philosophy. I mean, it destabilizes, it tears down. But as we talked about, it just never seems to have a clear positive program that is devoid of its own power structures, manipulative mechanisms, alienations, even false consciousness examples. So as you have written, critical theory is not reformist. Like you said, the critical theorist is not satisfied with saying, well, there's a bug in the system, let's fix the bug. They're like, we need to tear down the system because the bug is deeply baked into this, so to speak. So it comes back to a more pointed question. Should the advocates of critical theory be held to the high standard they propose for every system they seek to destroy?
That's a good question. And I think the answer on one level has to be, I'm not sure whether holding them to high standard is the way I'd approach it, but to say, I want to know what you think is going to replace this with.
Yeah.
I want a positive vision here.
Yep.
And this, again, being Christians, you and I, we can point to something. I can say, I have a vision. I have a vision for you. You can read the Bible. You can read Augustine's City of God. And that gives you something of the positive vision. Now, obviously, as Christians, we know there are mysteries to the eschaton. We cannot conceptualize exactly what the beatific vision will be like, but we can put some flesh on the bones, give some content to that concept. I think the problem with critical theorists is to return to that quotation you gave from Goethe right at the start, it is the spirit that negates. For everything that is must be brought to non-existence at some point. And that, I think, is the real problem. And again, in some ways, it also tilts me towards thinking that individual critical theorists are often little more than posers. One of the great ironies is in the rebellions, the student revolutions of '68, Theodor Adorno's class is occupied by students. And what does he do? He calls the police. Adorno is the epitome of the man who grew up in wealthy privilege, and he's a bourgeois guy till the day he dies. And as soon as the revolution arrives on his own doorstep, he's calling in, the agents of the capitalist empire to solve the problem.
Yes. A faint-hearted theorist, critical theorist.
Yeah. So I think there is we shouldn't be intimidated by critical theorists. I think I would say I'm happy to concede the legitimacy of many of the questions they ask. But what I want is more meat on the bones. And another thing I would say about Christians who dabble with this stuff is I want to know where the guardrails are.
Yes.
If you're a Christian who's into critical race theory, tell me why the methodological and philosophical principles that undergird critical race theory don't permanently hamstring you from offering a response to the sexual revolution, for example.
What's interesting too about this is that your book raises an honest engagement with this. And like you said, I love that what you said at the very beginning of our conversation, what's the legitimate question? If there's a fundamental question that points out a flaw, let's engage it. And let's see what we can do about the flaw. The problem, it seems, that the modern advocates of critical theory, as soon as they get into deep water, that a smart question, say, posed by you, might put them in, all of a sudden the conversation is shut down. The claim is bigotry. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to basically disarm by labeling, disarm by yelling, disarm by walking away and saying, well, there's nothing more to be said here. When in fact, one would say, if this is a legitimate area of inquiry and engagement, then let's inquire and engage about it.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing there to something. I don't know if George Lukács says this specifically, but certainly it's the tenor of a lot of his writings, and that is that when it comes to questions, it's not what is being asked that is important; it is who is asking. Don't ask what the question says. Ask who the person asking the question is. And that, goes to that idea of, if Trueman asks the question, to answer it is to grant Trueman legitimacy.
Yeah, right.
Trueman's asking this question precisely because he's an immigrant white guy with an interest in maintaining the current system as it stands and keeping you, the one of whom he's asking the question, out of a position of power. So I think, it's ask not what, but ask who. That's a big part of the sort of critical theoretical apparatus.
Segment 4, What's a Christian to Do? In To Change All Worlds, Carl Trueman writes, quote, "The Achilles heel of so much critical theory, past and present, is its historicism and its deep suspicion of essentialism, which prohibits from articulating a clear anthropology that then prevents it from offering a cogent view of the future in anything more than hopeful pieties." Close quote. So, Carl, from Hegel to Marx, from Lukács to the Frankfurt School, and adding in Nietzsche, Freud, Reich, Foucault, as well as the broader culture industry, we've seen kind of an orgy of philosophical attacks on religion, marriage, the family, heterosexuality, monogamy, childbearing, not to mention modern attacks on gender, race, and the fundamental nature of what it means to be human. So as a historian of ideas, but also as a Christian, what is your sense about why there is such a relentless, inexorable passion to attack the fundamental nature of what it means to be human?
Yeah, well, if I was to give a theological answer, I would say it's because desecration makes us feel powerful. An attack on what it means to be human is an attack on the image of God, which is by implication an attack on God himself. If we seize control of what it means to be human, then we think that we are declaring our autonomy from God. So I think that lies at the heart of this. Iconoclasm, we'd have been on different sides in the Reformation, I'm sure, but one of the reasons why the Reformation succeeds is it allows young men to smash stuff up. I say that to my students, you never lose in history if you allow young men to go out and throw bricks through windows. And, one of the appeals of critical theory today is it smashes stuff up. And that's exhilarating. It feeds our sense of autonomy. And shaking our fist or thumbing our nose at God, that's the biggest buzz as human beings we can give ourselves. Nietzsche understood that. And I think it underlies a lot of the appeal of and not just critical theory of the left, but why is critical theory migrating to the right? We're living in an era where much on the right is very iconoclastic and burn it to the ground as well. Why did people in 2016, when Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race, many of them switched to Donald Trump because they thought that he represented a similar kind of iconoclasm, but on a different side of things. That's not a pro-anti-Trump comment, by the way. It's simply observing that there's a certain iconoclasm that grips the modern mind across the political spectrum at the moment. That's fertile soil for the sort of the intellectual contributions of critical theory.
So, Carl, it seems there's a void in Marxist and critical theory anthropology, or at least something that turns man into a little more than a cog in the economic machine or a nihilistic slave to his basest passions. So in the closing pages of To Change All Worlds, you write the following, quote, "All of the central challenges to human existence identified by the critical theorists are resolved in Christ," close quote. Yeah. So how effectively can Christian anthropology, and understanding that we are dignified children of God, we're fallible in our sin, but we're redeemable through the graces of Christ, how can that understanding of Christian anthropology successfully counter the Marxist critical theory anthropology?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things I'd say to that. I think, first of all, I want to distinguish, if you like, the catechetical work of our churches from the practical outreach of our churches. I don't want to radically separate them, but just separate them for sort of descriptive purposes here. I think it's very important that priests, pastors, ministers, elders, Christian teachers understand that at the heart of what's going on in modern culture is a battle over anthropology. What does it mean to be human? C.S. Lewis puts his finger on that in the 1940s with the abolition of man. So I think it's important to realize that, in church history, I teach church history profession. It's been my life for the last 30 years. Each epoch of church history raises particularly critical issues, whether it's the doctrine of God in the 4th century, Christ in the 5th century, the sacraments and authority in the 16th century. Today it's anthropology, and I think it behooves church leaders in particular to think very deeply about what does it mean to be human and to find ways of catechizing Christian people in that, giving them a realistic understanding of what it means to be human, made in God's image but fallen. Give us a realistic understanding of what that means for what we can do in society. So I think there's a definite catechetical dimension to this. The second strand of it is, if you were to say to me, what's the one good ambition and the one tragic failure of critical theory, I would say the great ambition, the good ambition of critical theory, certainly in its classical sort of Frankfurt form, is this. It wants to expose the way human beings treat each other as objects. And it wants to realize a world where we all treat each other as subjects, as persons. To use Kant's language, we treat each other as ends, not as means to ends. The great tragedy of critical theory is that it delivers the exact opposite.
Yes.
It brings objectification of human beings back in spades. The sexual revolution that was meant to liberate women has actually made them into the sexual objects and playthings of men like nothing else in the history of mankind has ever done on such a dramatic scale. Pornography, pouring out of every smartphone owned by everybody on the face of the earth. Pornography, which is I think the logical outworking of the sexual revolution, does that in a grotesque way. This is incidentally why Max Horkheimer, towards the end of his life, was pulling back and I think even flirting with Catholicism, because he realized that the sexual revolution had delivered the exact opposite of what it promised. So that raises the question then of what do Christians do in that context? And here I said, this is where I think we need to think more broadly than arguments. We can argue with critical theorists till we're blue in the face. The best way to articulate how to treat people as subjects rather than objects is, guess what? It's to treat them as subjects rather than objects. And I think the church is our churches are superbly placed for this, because the church of all things should be the one place where people turn up and get treated as persons. I love the language of the Old Testament. It's in the Aaronic blessing, and it's used in the Psalms a number of times. Let the face of God shine upon you. In the church, God looks upon us face to face. I love that passage in Exodus 32, where Moses is described as meeting in the tabernacle with God. And we said there, God would speak to Moses as a man speaks to his friend, face to face. The church is the place where we can have real face-to-face community. The church is the place where we can have hospitality. The church is the place where we don't get to choose who we hang out with. The church it should be just this, from a human perspective, random cross-section of society. All those people that you really want to try to avoid during the week, you're going to bump into them in church on a Sunday. And it's an opportunity to be treated like a subject and to treat others like subjects. So at the end of my book, I really go for let's do the Marxist, if you like, revolutionary practice thing. The answer to critical theory is not an argument so much as it is a way of life. And I think the church provides that. And you see, even the language that the Bible uses about Christ connects us to the concerns that critical theory wants to raise. If the quest is for true freedom, well, we have that language. If the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. Think about the analogy of Christ and the church to marriage. I say to students, what is the great thing about marriage? Well, the great thing about a long and happy marriage is that you become increasingly free in a long and happy marriage. And what do I mean by that? Not that you can do anything you want, but the longer and the happier your marriage is, the more your desires and the desires of your wife or your spouse are one and the same. And submitting yourself to the other and doing what you want to do become increasingly exactly the same thing. Wow. Belonging and freedom, which is the big quest of Marxism, the big quest of critical theory. How can we be free and belong to a bigger thing than ourselves at the same time? That's resolved in marriage. And I think it's not coincidental that the Bible uses that analogy for the relationship of Christ and the church. What is the relationship between Christ and the church? It's that realization of Augustinian freedom. Not the freedom to do A or do B, but the freedom to love God and love those made in his image without let or hindrance. That will only be realized in the eschaton, in a perfect form. But the church here on earth is a little foretaste of that. So I would say, Christian response needs to be an ecclesial response. We need to think of our community life in the church. There are other aspects of that. There's word, there's sacrament. There are all these other things that feature in that. But there's also that hospitality dimension. The best argument for happy marriage is what? It's a happy marriage. Yes, I can lend you books on happy marriages, but man, being in the home of somebody with a happy marriage, that has more impact on the way we think about marriage than 100 books you could read on the subject.
Dr. Carl Trueman, Christian professor and historian of ideas, thank you. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
Been great fun, Todd. Thanks for having me on.
So I've been thinking, what has the Frankfurt School wrought? Using the tool of critical theory, a creation credited to Karl Marx, this coterie of German philosophers has constructed a narrative that has drawn the sympathy of many. The world is comprised of social hierarchies, and the power structures that emerge from them inevitably lead to human relations defined by the oppressor and the oppressed. In capitalism, it is reasoned, the rich owners of capital oppress the poor workers. In modern race relations, it is argued, white individuals oppress non-white individuals. Men oppress women, heterosexuals oppress homosexuals, cisgender oppress transgender. It goes on and on and on. Now, when I describe this narrative as having drawn the sympathy of many, I was trying to say that there is a kernel of relatable truth in this sweeping oppressor-oppressed construct. Hailing back to the Industrial Revolution, workers were, in fact, often paid low wages for long hours on dangerous jobs and with little ownership. Looking back to the 19th century, a significant contingent of the American South did, in fact, own Black individuals as slaves. And looking at examples in the 20th century, there are clear instances of gay individuals being treated as less than human by their straight counterparts. So let's be clear. Some of what the Frankfurt School said was true, but not all. In time, the capitalist system evolved so that workers could unionize, could be protected with various labor laws, could have increased access to investment and ownership through stocks and partnerships of their work. The American system of slavery and segregation, in fact, was fought and ultimately legislated out of existence. And there has been a growing sensibility that all human beings, no matter one's religious or political predilections, deserve a fundamental sense of dignity. That said, notwithstanding these changes, critical theory has come at us like a freight train in the last decade. Vehemently, this theory asserted that the oppression is intractable and unforgivable, systemic and worse than ever. Any attempt to say, now just wait a minute, and seek clarity, to pose incisive questions or simply disagree with shoddy thinking is met with spasms of outrage and accusations of bigotry. Emotional blackmail, junk science, and flawed statistics are used unapologetically to crush dissent and advance the narrative. Just think about it. Everywhere you look, there's a claim of victimhood, or as the critical theorists might dub it, alienation. True, there are victims, people who are the targets of unrepentant hatred. But does that mean that a uniform block of people with one thing in common carries universal guilt, while a uniform block of people with another thing in common carry universal victimhood? Come on. Are Michelle Obama and Clarence Thomas greater victims because of race than a poor white dirt farmer in Appalachia? Is Caitlyn Jenner more alienated than a cisgender bit actor endlessly working tables in Hollywood? Is Ellen DeGeneres more oppressed than the straight custodian who swept her television studio floor? Common sense questions deserve to be raised and asked. But in asking these common sense questions that invoke sane nuance amidst insane generalizations, a person could be accused of having a false consciousness. They are a slave to the mindset of systemic oppression, it is said, and thus cannot be trusted to think clearly. In effect, the vanguard of this philosophy insists, I have no argument to rebut you, so I am simply going to call you bigot and cancel you. Ever notice how dissenting views, generally religious and or conservative views, are treated on college campuses and public squares? Not with cool debate and sound reason, but with screaming rage and disorienting chaos, anything to keep people from hearing the countervailing perspective. The greatest argument for critical theorists is no arguments. Silence the opposition, obliterate the debate, cancel the enemy. In 1710, author and wit Jonathan Swift wrote, "Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it." The trouble with critical theory is that it either trades in outright lies or, at best, half-truths. It proposes facile generalizations, advocates scorched earth tactics, and then has no idea how to rebuild without, in fact, recreating the very system it just destroyed. Again, critical theory has a point up to a point. But time and again, critical theorists go roaring recklessly off the ideological cliff. It is up to us to think, to discern bad thinking, and to understand the pedigree of shoddy thought so that we may not be swept up in a credulous ascent born out of emotional blackmail. As one great thinker once said, don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. And one last thing. Read To Change All Worlds, Carl Trueman's outstanding exploration of the underpinnings of critical theory and its champion, the Frankfurt School. But also be sure to check out Carl's other works of trenchant analysis, such as The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Strange New World, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. Carl's work is sensible social commentary at its best. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.